What are the 40k fundamentals, your bread and butter tactics that are going to help you to win games? Hello and welcome to Epic Flail 40k Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about evergreen strategies, core 40k concepts that transcend factions and editions. Understanding these concepts will pay off game after game. Let's get started. First and foremost is going to be something you've probably heard about. You might refer to it as something different. And this concept is essentially the idea that we will position our units in such a way where we can achieve something in exchange for something else. Now, that might be our opponent's units. For one of our units, we're effectively trading our unit for their unit, or we could be trading some other resource or position in game. It's become a more commonly used term in 40k. I won't go into masses of detail here, as I've done a video around trading before, looking at 40k as a resource management game, where we want to be trying to trade up our resources into what our opponent is doing. I.e., we kill a unit that's worth 200 points with our 100 point unit, we've traded up. So at a very basic level, that is good. And if we're on the other side of that exchange, that is bad for us. As if we're continuing to do that throughout the course of a game, we're going to very quickly run out of units before our opponent. Trading something else in game could be a physical space on the board. So I'm going to push forward and distract a unit or move block a unit so that another part of my army can then occupy a part of the board uncontested. And in that scenario, we're throwing a unit under the bus, we're trading a unit of ours in order for us to be able to score some points on an objective or a secondary mission, or exist in a part of the board, trading down, sacrificing that unit to tie up a powerful enemy for a turn. The key thing to remember is it's all about victory points at the end of the battle. Setting up a unit to die gloriously whilst denying our opponents control of a key objective for 1 or 2 turns could potentially swing the game in our favour, even if we've lost out in terms of we've had units destroyed at the cost of no units destroyed from our opponent. It's more than a simple exchange of units. It's an exchange of opportunities, scoring potential, victory points. This next one is more complex, and it's going to sound not very complex when I say what it is, and that's basically hiding, but it's more than just using line of sight blocking terrain to stop you from being shot off the board. Again, I've done videos on this, on deployment and hiding behind terrain, as I often see especially newer players just deploying straight up on the line or not taking a moment to double check where their opponents are going to be able to move turn 1 to then get angles. It's more than just keeping your units safe from unnecessary damage that you don't need to take if you just simply set up a bit better. But it's that and more. It's making a conscious decision that we're not going to engage in the way that our opponent wants us to do. It's such a simple thing, but it's incredibly powerful. The game is brutal and unforgiving, and if we extend too early, we can be giving our opponents a gift, an easy way of scoring points or just getting kills, and limiting our options in the game as the game progresses. Whereas if we exercise restraint, double down on the efforts to hide and not engage with our opponent, we can potentially set up turns where we can overwhelm later in the game and then not give our opponents the same amount of turns to do damage back to us. It's the opposite of rushing forward with everything, as sometimes, again, I see people do in games when they think that they might be at a disadvantage, so they just go full send turn 1. Okay, I've probably lost this game against this really shooty army, I haven't got much opportunity for cover, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to overwhelm my opponent and I'm going to keep them in their deployment zones turn 1, and I've gone first, I've got the initiative, I'm going to prevent them from scoring, and they might push them back and deny them scoring primary on turns 2, maybe turns 3, but then as the later turns hit, they don't have much of an army left, and because that shooty army then went second, they're able to jump on objectives and make up that scoring in the final turns of the game, and now we're suddenly getting zeros on primary because we've virtually been tabled. And so if we can change that dynamic a little bit, where we offer very few targets to our opponents, really utilize terrain, actively choose a path of low engagement with what our opponent is trying to do, not just run into their guns, but actually think, okay, I'm going to wait for an opportunity to pick something off that's had to maybe go out and get some points on secondaries, particularly in scenarios where if we're going first and we deny our opponents getting any meaningful damage on us, in the subsequent turn they're going to have a struggle to then get on primary, in which case we can start picking them off, maybe just small sections of our army, to just deny them primary when it goes back to their turn, keep the scoring quite low, force our opponents into a position where they're having to break formation, not necessarily castle up or screen us as well as they might have done in that first turn, predicting an alpha strike or us to go full send, particularly if they're playing tactical missions. What this will do is blank any of their offensive cards if they've got to shoot us off of objectives or kill units. If we've gone full denial mode and we're not engaging them, not giving them opportunities to score those kind of points, that's really frustrating for our opponents. And then doubly so if they're then having to push out to try and score other tactical cards where they might have to push out a little bit into no man's land or board edges or even the middle of the board. If we've staged behind ruins and we're nice and hidden and not presenting targets, then they've got to expose parts of their force to be able to achieve those points. That could be the opening that we need once we've spent that turn moving up, getting into position to really capitalize on our opponents having to move in a way that they don't want to, so that when we do strike, it's more on our terms, i.e. we can pick off parts of our opponent's army and be hidden from any repercussion if they've had to wander out to a further part of the board away from the main body of their force where their big guns can't quite get angles on that unit that's had to wander out, or simply through utilising the extra movement and hiding for that turn, we've got further up the board, so then we're able to move and get into better positions ourselves. Simply because we've waited a turn or two, we're a bit closer, so our angles are better or our charge distances are now shorter with more units than if we tried to push from the early turns. And I've been talking about this from a perspective of an aggressive army that wants to maybe charge in the early turns. That's not how all the factions are, and some armies are MSU style armies that may or may not want to be in combat, but they could just be an MSU army that's designed to score the points really, really well. Demons is a good example of this at the moment. Lots of small little annoying units that are quite maneuverable that actually don't mind not engaging. They can just move about the board and score points, score secondaries, actions, primary missions really, really well. And so this idea of hiding and not engaging with the enemy really plays into that style of army where we're just trying to score points and deny opportunities for our opponents to score. Whether or not we actually end up killing a lot of our opponent's army is by the by. The objective is often to not engage and to focus on scoring the mission points, and that is indeed something that you can take to the nth degree. You can really create army lists that excel at doing that rather than just killing, and so it's an important part of 40k and scoring and doing well in games is the ability to keep your units safe, not just throw them under the bus at the first opportunity you can get or get them stuck into fighting. Yes, it's very cinematic, but actually thinking about how can I keep my army alive as long as possible? How can I hide them as best as possible? And sometimes you can hide them in combat. Being engaged with something actually offers them a degree of protection, as they can't then be shot back by other things. If you're fighting a particularly weak target, that can be the best place to hide, is in the middle of combat, which is very useful as well. So yeah, hiding's great. That's your army's plan, just to hide, score points. You've gone MSU, not really worrying about killing stuff, or you're staging, or you're simply just trying not to get shot off the board. You're a shooting army yourself and you're hiding from the big threats your opponent's got whilst trying to get firing lanes on what your opponent's exposed. In any of those scenarios, understanding how terrain works, how line of sight works, and what your unit's limitations are defensively is really important. It's going to help you to get the most out of your units. Just want to take a moment to say, if you're enjoying this content, then check out Epic Flail HQ. There's a Monday podcast, battle reports, tournament streams, and I also produce members-only content there as well. So if you like what you see here, check out Epic Flail HQ and consider becoming a member. We've got an awesome Discord and an awesome growing community. And then we have my personal favourite. I enjoy this kind of strategy. It's not always the best, but it's the most fun that I have when I'm playing 40k, and that is overwhelming our opponent, giving our opponent lots of decision points at once, or lots of threats, high pressure. World Eaters is a textbook example of this, orcs as well, and it's very risky, but it can be a high risk, high reward strategy. And the premise is essentially presenting our opponent with so many threats at once, they simply cannot deal with them all. And we have to take care here, because if we're going against some armies, really shooty armies like the Votan Terminator unit that can just throw so many shots out, or Tau, or even just another combat army which could screen you a bit, take the brunt of what you've sent, and then they've got the pick of where they want to choose the assaults, and they can either do the same thing back to you or just zero in on a threat. So you have to be careful about how we apply this, and when we apply this is if our opponent can deal with this, that's something we want to try and assess and understand before we commit. But the psychology is really powerful. 40k is very much a strategic and mental game, and when we present our opponents with multiple threats at once, we create that psychological thought and worry, and they have to decide how to prioritize, and that can lead to errors in judgment. And we don't always want to rely on our opponent making a mistake, and the better our opponents are, less likely they are to make a mistake. But if we assume that our opponent is not going to make a mistake, the crux of this really hinges on something's going to get through. If you throw enough at a wall, some of it's got to stick, right? So this is where the brute force element and the threat overload comes in, where we commit a massive portion, if not all of our army, into our opponent, and we essentially say, can you deal with this? And if our assessment has been good and we have been able to put our opponent in a situation where their army can't possibly deal with all of that at once, something's going to live, and then that's what we can then really use to drive that momentum, push our opponents back off of scoring and doing lots of damage at once, and take control of the game that way. The best defense is, after all, good offense. And I often enjoy this strategy because this is a very powerful thing to do, and when it goes well, it feels great. And so it's tempting to try and get that buzz every game. And so this strategy is something that I advise caution with, because the assessment of our opponent's army and our army is really important in understanding, fundamentally, is this going to work? And that is also true of each of the other strategies that I mentioned as well. There is no point just hoping something's going to work. More often than not, that will lead to disappointment. And just because something works in one game doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in another game. Maybe the opponent was different, maybe their play style was different, maybe they deployed in a way that you weren't expecting. Assessment and reflection, understanding what is happening in the games and reacting to that as we play is very important. And I talk about that in more detail in this video here. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.